It all started with a letter, not the kind you'd expect, a friendly note from a neighbor or an invitation to a community event. No, this one was cold and formal, typed in stark black letters on crisp white paper. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Asterisk failure to comply with HOA regulations will result in immediate foreclosure proceedings. Asterisk. I read it again, my hands trembling. Foreclosure. Over what? A few roses in the yard. That's what this whole mess boiled down to, roses. Red ones, to be exact. They weren't even unusual. They were just flowers. But according to Mrs. Harper, the president of our homeowners association, HOA, those roses were non-compliant. Apparently, they didn't match Willow Creek's approved list of plants. Who knew there was such a thing? When I showed the letter to Daniel, my husband, he let out a low whistle. "They're serious about this?" he asked, shaking his head. We both thought it was ridiculous at first. How could anyone take gardening rules so seriously? But then came more letters, each nastier than the last. Fines piled up, $50 here, $100 there, for things we didn't even know were wrong. Our mailbox color, wrong. The height of our hedges, too tall. Even the way we parked our car in the driveway somehow broke some obscure rule buried deep in the HOA handbook. At first, we tried reasoning with them. We went to meetings, pleaded our case, promised to fix whatever needed fixing. But nothing worked. Mrs. Harper sat at the head of the table during those meetings, her perfectly styled silver hair catching the light as she tapped her pen against her clipboard. She never raised her voice, never lost her composure. Her calmness was scarier than any shouting match. Rules exist for a reason, she'd say, her lips curving into a tight smile. We must maintain standards. Standards. That word kept coming up. Standards for lawns, standards for houses, standards for people. It felt less like living in a neighborhood and more like being trapped in a museum where everything had to look perfect but felt lifeless. Things got worse after that. Neighbors who used to wave hello now avoided us. Someone spray-painted non-compliant on our driveway one night. Another time, our mailbox disappeared entirely, leaving behind only splintered wood. Anonymous notes appeared regularly, slipped under our door or tucked into our fence. Each one carried the same message: conform or get out. Daniel tried to reassure me. Ignore them, he said. They're just bullies. But ignoring them wasn't easy. Every creak of the floorboards at night made me jump. Was someone watching us? Were these harmless disputes turning into something darker? One evening, while watering the roses I refused to remove, I spotted Mrs. Harper across the street. She stood on her porch, clipboard in hand, jotting something down as she watched me. When she noticed me looking, she gave a polite wave. Not friendly, but smug, like she already knew she'd won. The final straw came when we couldn't keep up with the fines anymore. Bills piled up faster than we could pay them. Our savings dwindled. Stress seeped into every corner of our lives. Daniel worked longer hours, avoiding the tension altogether. I spent sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how it had come to this, all because of a few flowers. And then the letter arrived, the one that changed everything. Eviction. They wanted us gone, and they weren't asking nicely. Selling the house felt like surrender, like giving Mrs. Harper exactly what she wanted. But as Daniel reminded me, sometimes you have to retreat before you can fight back. That's when the idea came to me. If they forced me out, fine. But I wouldn't leave without making sure Mrs. Harper paid for what she'd done. The day after the eviction notice arrived, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, staring at the roses that had started this whole mess. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. Selling the house felt like admitting defeat, but staying meant fighting a battle we couldn't win. The fines, the threats, the constant pressure, it was exhausting. And yet, deep down, I knew I couldn't just walk away, not without doing something. That's when I called my brother, Ethan. He's always been the practical one in the family, The guy who knows how to turn bad situations into opportunities. When I told him about Mrs. Harper and the HOA's antics, he didn't sound surprised. "Sounds like she's playing dirty," he said. "But if you're selling, why not sell smart?" "Smart?" I asked, confused. "What does that mean?" Ethan explained his plan over the phone, his voice calm but excited. "Think about it," he said. "If the HOA has scared everyone into thinking their property values are dropping, they'll be desperate to sell. You can buy low, then use those properties to take control of the HOA yourself." I wasn't sure I understood at first. Control the HOA? How? "By owning enough houses, you get voting power," he said. "Once you have a majority, you can change the rules, or kick her out entirely." The idea sounded crazy, but also kind of brilliant. If anyone could pull off a scheme like this, it was Ethan. He flew in the very next day, armed with spreadsheets, contracts, and a determination that matched mine. Over coffee, he laid everything out for me. "Here's the deal," he said. "We start by listing your house quietly. Find a buyer willing to pay cash. Fast. Use that money to snap up other properties in the neighborhood. Cheap ones. People here are already spooked. They'll jump at quick offers." It made sense, but part of me hesitated. Wasn't this exactly what Mrs. Harper had done? Manipulated the system for her own gain. But then I thought about all the pain she'd caused, not just to us, but to so many others. This wasn't about revenge. It was about balance, about taking back control from someone who'd abused it for too long. So we got to work. First, we listed our house. It hurt more than I expected. Walking through empty rooms, packing up memories, stripping the walls bare, it felt like losing a piece of myself. But every signature on the dotted line brought me closer to justice. Within weeks, Ethan helped me buy 2 more houses in Willow Creek, both below market value. Desperate homeowners practically begged us to take them off their hands. Word spread quickly. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, speculating about who was buying up the neighborhood. Some thought it was a corporate takeover. Others guessed it was revenge. No one suspected it was me. Even Mrs. Harper seemed oblivious. At least, she pretended to be. I caught her watching me sometimes, her sharp eyes narrowing as if trying to piece together the puzzle. But she underestimated me, just like everyone else. By the end of the month, I owned 5 properties, enough to secure a seat on the HOA board. The thought of sitting across from Mrs. Harper, seeing her smug expression falter for the first time, gave me a thrill I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about winning. When the announcement came that I joined the board, the reaction was immediate and dramatic. At the next meeting, neighbors stared at me, some shocked, others curious. Mrs. Harper tried to keep her composure, but I saw the flicker of unease in her eyes. For the first time, she didn't look untouchable. She looked worried, and she should be. Because now, the game had changed. Sitting at the HOA meeting for the first time as a board member felt surreal. The same long wooden table, the same stiff chairs, the same faces I'd come to dread. But now, I was on the other side of it. Mrs. Harper sat at the head of the table, her usual spot, tapping her pen against her clipboard with practiced precision. She gave me a tight smile when I walked in, but there was something new in her eyes. Uncertainty. "Welcome to the team," she said, her voice clipped and overly formal. It wasn't warm or welcoming. It was more like a warning. But I didn't care. This seat wasn't about fitting in anymore. It was about exposing the truth. Being on the board gave me access to everything. Financial records, membership lists, private emails. Ethan had warned me not to jump the gun, but curiosity got the better of me. Late one night, after Daniel had gone to bed, I cracked open the files I'd borrowed from the HOA office. What I found made my blood boil. Decades of mismanagement, shady deals, and outright corruption stared back at me. Mrs. Harper hadn't just been enforcing rules. She'd been using the HOA as her personal piggy bank. Funds earmarked for community projects disappeared into thin air. Money meant for fixing potholes and repainting playgrounds somehow ended up paying for her backyard pool renovation. Worse still were the emails, dozens of them, detailing how she bullied residents who dared question her authority. Threats, lies, manipulation. It was all there in black and white. The more I read, the angrier I became. How could someone get away with this for so long? And why hadn't anyone stopped her? Then it hit me. Fear. Fear kept people silent. Fear let Mrs. Harper stay in power. But not anymore. I spent days gathering evidence, organizing documents, and building a case. Every piece fit together perfectly, painting a picture of greed and abuse that even the most skeptical neighbor couldn't ignore. When I finally felt ready, I called an emergency meeting. Rumors spread quickly through Willow Creek. Something big was happening, and everyone wanted to know what. The day of the meeting, the community center buzzed with nervous energy. Neighbors filled the room, whispering among themselves. Some looked excited, others uneasy. Mrs. Harper arrived last, sweeping in like a queen entering her court. She took her usual seat, arranging her papers with deliberate calm. If she noticed the tension in the air, she didn't show it. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up slowly, letting the silence stretch just a little longer than necessary. All eyes were on me. I'm here today because we need to talk about the truth. I began, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. For years, Mrs. Harper has led this HOA with an iron fist. But leadership isn't about control. It's about trust. And trust has been broken. One by one, I laid out the evidence. Financial statements showed funds disappearing without explanation. Photos revealed lavish upgrades to Mrs. Harper's home paid for with HOA money. Emails exposed threats and intimidation tactics aimed at anyone who opposed her. Gasps rippled through the crowd as I spoke, followed by murmurs of disbelief. Faces turned toward Mrs. Harper, confusion giving way to anger. She tried to interrupt, to defend herself, but her excuses sounded hollow. Her polished facade cracked under the weight of undeniable proof. By the end of my presentation, the room was alive with outrage. Voices shouted accusations, fists pounded tables. For the first time, Mrs. Harper looked small, vulnerable. Her reign of fear was crumbling, and she knew it. As the meeting descended into chaos, I leaned across the table, locking eyes with her. "You're done," I said quietly, so only she could hear. "Resign, or I'll make sure the authorities know exactly what you've done." Her face went pale. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. Defeat washed over her features. Without another word, she gathered her things and walked out, leaving behind a stunned audience and a neighborhood ready for change. The fallout from that explosive meeting was immediate and intense. Neighbors who had once tiptoed around Mrs. Harper now openly confronted her, or rather, they avoided her altogether. Gone were the polite nods and forced smiles she'd relied on to maintain her image of control. Instead, there was a palpable shift in the air. Fear had been replaced by defiance. Willow Creek was waking up, and I could feel the energy buzzing like electricity. Mrs. Harper didn't go quietly, though. In the days following her resignation, she tried to rally her remaining allies, but it was too late. Her power base had crumbled. The people she'd intimidated for years suddenly found their voices, sharing stories of mistreatment and manipulation at her hands. It seemed everyone had a tale to tell. Fines imposed unfairly, homes devalued because of petty disputes, friendships ruined over trivial violations. Even some of her closest supporters began distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with her tarnished reputation. With Mrs. Harper out of the picture, the HOA needed new leadership. I nominated several neighbors who I knew were honest and hardworking, people who genuinely cared about the community. Together, we rewrote the rules, stripping away the oppressive regulations that had made life in Willow Creek unbearable. No more nitpicking over mailbox colors or holiday decorations. No more astronomical fines for minor infractions. We focused instead on building a neighborhood where kindness mattered more than conformity, where people supported each other instead of tearing each other down. But as much as things improved, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't enough. Not yet. Justice meant more than just removing Mrs. Harper from power. It meant making sure she couldn't hurt anyone else ever again. And so, I turned my attention to her house. Her sprawling mansion sat at the end of the street, its pristine facade mocking everything she'd done to maintain her illusion of perfection. While the rest of us struggled under her iron-fisted rules, she lived in luxury, funded by stolen HOA money. Every time I passed her property, I felt a fresh surge of anger. She might have resigned, but she still acted like she owned the place, as if nothing had changed. That's when Ethan came up with an idea. Why not buy her out? He suggested one evening over dinner. She won't want to stick around here after everything that's happened. Offer her a fair price, and she'll take it. I hesitated. Buying her house would cost a significant chunk of the money I'd spent acquiring properties in Willow Creek. But then I thought about what it would mean, not just for me, but for the entire community. Owning her house would give me even more leverage, ensuring that no one could ever use it as a base to rebuild the toxic system she'd created. Plus, it would be the ultimate payback. We put together an offer and sent it to her lawyer. To our surprise, she accepted within days. Maybe she saw it coming, or maybe she was just eager to leave Willow Creek behind. Either way, the transaction went through quickly, and soon her mansion belonged to me. On moving day, workers showed up bright and early to pack her belongings. Confused and furious, she stormed out to confront them. "What is this?" she demanded, glaring at the foreman. "You can't do this." "Actually," I said, stepping out of my car, "we can. You sold the house, remember?" Her face turned red, then white. "You think you've won." She spat, her voice trembling with rage. "I don't think," I replied calmly. "I know." Watching her load her designer luggage into a moving truck was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. For years, she'd ruled Willow Creek with fear and intimidation. Now she was just another disgraced ex-resident, slinking away in shame. As the truck pulled out of the driveway, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. With her gone, I donated the mansion to a local nonprofit, transforming it into affordable housing for families struggling to make ends meet. It was a symbolic gesture, a way of giving back to the community she'd exploited for so long. Slowly but surely, Willow Creek began to heal. Life returned to the neighborhood. Kids played outside again. Laughter replaced whispers, and fences became less barriers and more conversation starters. But my work wasn't done yet. There was still one final piece of the puzzle to address. With Mrs. Harper officially out of Willow Creek, the neighborhood began to breathe again. It was as if a dark cloud had lifted, and for the first time in years, people felt safe to be themselves. Kids rode their bikes down the streets without fear of being scolded for improper sidewalk use. Front yards bloomed with flowers of every color, not just the approved ones, and mailboxes stood proudly in shades of blue, green, and even bright yellow. The oppressive rules that once dictated our lives were gone, replaced by common sense and mutual respect. But I knew this transformation wouldn't last unless we addressed the root of the problem. The culture of control that Mrs. Harper had cultivated. Even though she was gone, her influence lingered in subtle ways. Whispers of doubt, lingering fears, and old habits that were hard to break. Some neighbors still hesitated to speak up at meetings, worried about rocking the boat. Others clung to outdated ideas about what made a perfect community. If we wanted Willow Creek to truly heal, we needed to rebuild trust and foster a spirit of collaboration. That's why I decided to focus on bringing people together. First, I organized a series of open forums where residents could share their thoughts without judgment. These weren't formal HOA meetings. They were casual gatherings held in backyards and parks, complete with lemonade stands and potluck dinners. The goal was simple: create a space where everyone felt heard. At first, attendance was sparse. People were wary, unsure if this was another trap or trick. But as word spread that these events were safe and welcoming, more neighbors started showing up. One evening, during one of these forums, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patel stood up to speak. Her voice trembled at first, but she quickly found her courage. For years, I was afraid to hang wind chimes outside my window, she admitted. Mrs. Harper said they were eyesores, but those chimes reminded me of my childhood in India. They brought me joy. Tears welled in her eyes as she finished speaking, and the crowd erupted into applause. Moments like these became common, a release valve for years of pent-up frustration and pain. Inspired by stories like Mrs. Patel's, I launched a new initiative called Willow Creek Reimagined. Its mission was to celebrate individuality while strengthening our sense of community. We hosted art shows featuring local talent, planted trees in honor of fallen neighbors, and organized block parties where everyone was invited. Slowly but surely, the rigid lines that had divided us began to blur. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now shared meals and exchanged gardening tips. Friendships blossomed, and Willow Creek began to feel like home again, not just for some, but for everyone. Still, there was one final step to ensure Mrs. Harper's legacy would never return: accountability. With Ethan's help, I filed a formal complaint with local authorities, providing all the evidence we gathered against her: embezzlement, fraud, intimidation. It was all there in black and white. While nothing could erase the damage she'd done, holding her accountable sent a clear message: abuse of power would not be tolerated in Willow Creek. As the investigation unfolded, news of Mrs. Harper's misdeeds spread beyond our neighborhood. Reporters showed up, eager to tell the story of how a small-town HOA president had been taken down by the very people she sought to control. Some neighbors worried about negative attention, but most agreed it was worth it. Transparency, after all, was key to preventing history from repeating itself. By the time autumn rolled around, Willow Creek looked different, not just on the surface, but deep down. The air felt lighter, the streets friendlier. Even the roses in my front yard seemed to bloom brighter than ever before. As I stood on my porch one evening, watching kids chase fireflies under a starlit sky, I realized something important. Revenge hadn't fixed everything. What had healed us was connection, the bonds we rebuilt when we stopped letting fear dictate our lives. And yet there was still one last piece of unfinished business waiting for me. The final piece of unfinished business weighed heavily on my mind. Even as Willow Creek continued to heal, it wasn't just about making things right in the neighborhood. It was personal now. Mrs. Harper might have left, but her presence still lingered like a shadow over everything. I couldn't let her walk away without consequences, not after everything she'd done. Justice needed closure. One crisp morning, I received a call from the local authorities investigating her case. They had reviewed all the evidence and were ready to move forward with charges against her. "This is big," the officer told me over the phone. "We're talking serious penalties here: fines, restitution, maybe even jail time." Hearing those words gave me a sense of vindication, but it wasn't enough. Punishment through the legal system would take months, maybe years, and I wanted something more immediate, something symbolic. That's when inspiration struck. Remembering the mansion I'd purchased from her, I decided to turn it into a monument of change, a place that represented everything she wasn't: kindness, inclusivity, and community spirit. But before doing that, I planned one last act of defiance. I called Mrs. Harper directly. She answered reluctantly, her voice icy and clipped. "What do you want?" she asked, clearly irritated. "I wanted to let you know personally," I said, keeping my tone calm and measured, "that your old house, the one you used HOA funds to renovate, is being transformed into affordable housing for families who need it most." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice shook with barely contained fury. "You think this changes anything? You think taking my house makes you better than me?" "No," I replied firmly. "It doesn't make me better than you. It makes Willow Creek better." And isn't that what really matters? She hung up without another word, but I knew the message hit its mark. For someone like Mrs. Harper, whose entire identity revolved around wealth and control, seeing her prized possession turned into a resource for others must have felt like the ultimate humiliation. The transformation of the mansion became a community project. Neighbors volunteered their time and skills to repaint walls, repair floors, and landscape the yard. Children drew colorful murals on the fence surrounding the property, turning it into a vibrant canvas of hope. Local businesses donated furniture and supplies, eager to support the cause. By the time we finished, the once intimidating estate looked warm and inviting, a beacon of new beginnings. On the day of the grand opening, the entire neighborhood gathered to celebrate. Families toured the newly renovated units, marveling at how spacious and cozy they were. Kids ran through the backyard, laughing as balloons floated overhead. A ribbon-cutting ceremony marked the official start of Harmony House, as we'd named it, a tribute to the unity we'd fought so hard to achieve. As I stood there, watching people come together in joy instead of fear, I felt a profound sense of peace. This wasn't just about getting back at Mrs. Harper. It was about proving that kindness could triumph over cruelty, that cooperation could replace coercion. The scars of the past would always remain, but they no longer defined us. Still, as the sun set and the festivities wound down, I found myself reflecting on the journey. Willow Creek had changed, yes, but so had I. Once hesitant and unsure, I now understood the power of standing up for what's right, even when it feels impossible. And though the battle had been long and difficult, every moment of it had been worth it. But as I walked home that night, I realized something else. While revenge and justice had driven me this far, true healing came from letting go. From choosing to focus on building a brighter future instead of dwelling on the pain of the past. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. The months that followed the opening of Harmony House brought a new rhythm to Willow Creek, one marked by laughter, shared meals, and the simple joys of community life. The mansion, once a symbol of greed and control, had become a cornerstone of connection, a place where families found shelter, neighbors gathered for potlucks, and kids played tag in the sprawling backyard. Watching it transform filled me with a quiet pride, but more importantly, it reminded me of how far we'd come. Mrs. Harper's name rarely came up anymore. Occasionally, I hear whispers about her, how she'd moved to another state, how she was lying low after the legal fallout. But those stories felt distant, like echoes from another lifetime. What mattered now wasn't what she'd done, or where she'd gone. It was the fact that Willow Creek had risen above her influence. We weren't perfect. We never would be. But we were learning to embrace imperfection together. And that made all the difference. One evening, as Daniel and I sat on our porch sipping tea, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever wonder if you went too far?" he asked softly. I paused, considering his question. Had I crossed a line? Maybe. Buying her house, exposing her crimes, turning her downfall into a public spectacle. It hadn't always been easy to reconcile those actions with who I wanted to be. But then I thought about the fear she'd instilled in so many people, the way she'd twisted rules meant to protect into tools of oppression. Someone had to stand up to her. Someone had to say, "Enough." "No," I finally answered. "Not really. I mean, yeah, some parts of it were messy. But look at what happened because of it. People feel safe again. They feel free. Isn't that worth it?" Daniel nodded slowly, his lips curving into a small smile. "Yeah," he said, "it is." As winter approached, the neighborhood prepared for its annual holiday celebration, a tradition Mrs. Harper had once turned into yet another opportunity to enforce rigid rules. This year, though, things were different. Lights twinkled in every window, not just white ones, but multicolored strands that danced against the frosty air. Yards were decorated with handmade snowmen, nativity scenes, menorahs, and even a few inflatable dinosaurs. No one cared about approved designs anymore. They cared about joy. On the night of the event, the community center buzzed with warmth and cheer. Tables groaned under the weight of homemade casseroles, pies, and cookies. Carolers sang off-key but enthusiastically, their voices blending with the chatter of friends catching up and children laughing. At one point, someone handed me a mug of hot cocoa, and I stepped outside to take it all in. Snowflakes drifted down gently, settling on rooftops and bare tree branches. The sight took my breath away. Standing there, surrounded by the hum of happy voices, I realized something. Revenge hadn't healed us. It had started the process, sure, but the real healing came afterward, from rebuilding trust, fostering relationships, and choosing kindness over bitterness. Willow Creek wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. Its beauty lay in its cracks, in the imperfect ways people leaned on each other when times got tough. Later that night, as Daniel and I walked home hand in hand, I glanced back at the glowing windows and twinkling lights. For so long, I'd dreamed of leaving this place, of escaping the suffocating grip of the HOA. Now, I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. This neighborhood, these people, had become my family. And as I climbed into bed that night, listening to the soft hum of wind chimes somewhere in the distance, I smiled. The battle for Willow Creek was over. The war had been won, not with anger or vengeance, but with resilience, unity, and hope. And for the first time in years, I slept soundly, knowing I was exactly where I belonged.